voters have a choice in Ohio. They can choose to vote early by mail, they can choose to vote early in person at the Board of Elections, or they can choose to vote at their polling place on Election Day. It's been a process that's been around in Ohio for over a decade. We have security measures set in place to prevent any type of fraud coming through the mail.
From WLWT, this is Let's Talk Cincy, presented by Western and Southern Financial Group. Put our financial strength behind you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Curtis Fuller. Election Day is just over 1 month away. Today, I want to talk about the voting process in the upcoming election, as well as the power of your voice at the ballot box. Recently, one of my heroes retired from a position she's held since 1973. Marian Wright Edelman is the founder of the Children's Defense Fund. She's been one of the most influential voices in our nation on social issues. I'm reminded of a speech she gave in September 1987 before the Congressional Black Caucus. She said, quote, "People who do not vote have no line of credit with people who are elected and thus pose no threat to those who act against our interest," unquote. Which means you can't be a sideline spectator. You have to be involved in the process. So let's talk about a few basics. Everything from voting by mail to in-person early voting to Election Day itself. First things first, make sure you're registered to vote.
That's the very first step in this process, and the deadline to register to vote for this November election is October 5th. We also like to remind voters, many times voters only vote once every 4 years in presidential elections. So check our website or give us a call. Make sure that you are registered at the address that you currently live. So voters have a choice in Ohio. They can choose to vote early by mail, they can choose to vote early in person at the Board of Elections, or they can choose to vote at their polling place on Election Day. It's been a process that's been around in Ohio for over a decade. We have security measures set in place to prevent any type of fraud coming through the mail.
You can get an absentee ballot request form in person at the board, online at the board's website, or you can just hang on and the request form will come to you.
It's because the Secretary of State is mailing every registered voter in the state of Ohio that application. We've had this foundation and these guidelines from the Secretary of State that are uniform across the state for years. So it is a secure method of voting. And we know there's concerns about the post office, but we are working very closely with our local postmaster. We just had a Zoom meeting the other day with the local representatives from the post office. They ensure us they're ready to go and they're ready to handle the volume, and we're going to be coordinating and working together to make sure that we're staffed here properly at the board and that the post office is doing the same thing.
As for making sure your vote counts,
give us a call. Go onto our website, click Track My Ballot, and you can see exactly when we processed your application. In fact, once you voted your ballot, you can also check on our website to make sure the board has received your ballot and that it's been accepted for counting. We'll do everything we can here at the Board of Elections to process the applications and the ballots as quickly as possible. The post office is doing everything they can to move it. That's what they're telling us. But we need the voters to do their part, and they can help us out by, if they choose to vote by mail, send in those applications now. You'll be the very first to receive a ballot on October 6th when we're allowed to begin mailing them. And those are the very first ballots counted election night, are the vote by mail ballots, because we already have them here in our possession. So they're the very first results released after the polls close election night. So if you've already submitted an application, no need to submit that secondary application. But if a voter does, yes, we process that as what we refer to as a dupe. And we do receive many duplicate applications, but there's only one ballot will be mailed to the voter. So when the voter submits that application we've been talking about to the board, the voter has to provide their name, their address, their date of birth, a form of ID, and their signature. And all of that information has to match what we have on file here at the Board of Elections. If it doesn't match, we do not mail the voter a ballot. Instead, though, we do mail a notice to the voter, letting them know you missed one of these required pieces of information, and we give the voter the opportunity to cure that defect, so that we can then send them a ballot. Because many times, vast majority, it's a simple mistake by the voter. Then when the ballot is returned, the voted ballot is returned to the board, it's contained in what we call an identification envelope. And it has that same information, fields for that same information that was on the application. Again, the voter has to tell us their name, their address, a form of ID, and their signature. And that must match what's in our system in order to count the ballot. If it does not match, we send the voter again a notice, and the voter can cure that defect up until 7 days after Election Day in order to have their ballot counted in the official count.
Now, here are some important dates to remember. The deadline to register to vote in Ohio in the upcoming election is October 5th. Absentee voting by mail and early in-person voting begins October 6th. Voting on Election Day is Tuesday, November 3rd from 6:30 in the morning until 7:30 at night. Also, this should be obvious, but you can only vote once. In fact, there are serious penalties if it's proven that you intentionally cast more than one ballot. So if you receive a ballot by mail and then show up at the polls to vote, you'll be given a provisional ballot. Call it a safety net to ensure one voter, one ballot. Up next, the voice of Generation Z, the impact young voters could have on the upcoming election, when Let's Talk Cincy continues. A national poll just released by the Institute of Politics at the Harvard Kennedy School showed some interesting numbers regarding those between the ages of 18 and 29. 63% of respondents said they will definitely be voting. Now, according to the report, more than 15 million young Americans have turned 18 since the last presidential election. I spoke with some young voters to find out what their priorities are just weeks before Election Day.
I'm really excited to vote. I'm still one of those young people that actually want to do it.
1 in 10 eligible voters, part of Generation Z. 18-year-old Claire Prather is one of them, a communications design student at UC.
And I'm really excited that this is my first election, because I feel as if this vote could make a lot of change in our country right now, which for me, in my opinion, is needed. And I'm really excited about it, and I'm excited to be a part of that change.
Prather and other young voters could be an important voting bloc in November. The Pew Research Center finds Generation Z is generally progressive, pro-government, and likely to embrace diversity. In fact, Pew found this generation could be majority non-white by the year 2026. What I found is they have a zest for voting.
I truly believe in our election process. It's lasted us 240 years so far, and I think it'll continue to be good for the remainder of years.
We do need to do this, especially with everything that's been going on with, you know, Black Lives Matter and those types of things. Like, it's our responsibility to step up and say what we think and vote.
Everybody should go out and vote. Like, we live in this great country that allows us to have all these freedoms, so like, let's use them.
I'm really excited because I feel like I can make a difference with my vote, and my dad has always been super excited about voting and says that voting is really important. So he's kind of inspired me to take that same viewpoint.
I'd prefer a candidate that's looking for to help both sides, you know, not just really far one way or really far the other, just someone who's trying to, incorporate both sides of everything and try and be more of a middle ground than really radical either way.
Well, up next, a conversation with Ohio's top election official, Secretary of State Frank LaRose, talking turnout, ballot safety, poll workers, and more when Let's Talk Cincy continues. A century ago, brave women all across this country fought and won the right to vote. A similar battle to gain access to the ballot resulted in the 1965 Voting Rights Act, removing barriers preventing Black Americans from casting their votes. Now, as we head into the 2020 elections, there is an increased emphasis on making sure everyone has access to voting, particularly during this pandemic. Ohio Secretary of State Frank LaRose recently visited Cincinnati. We spoke with him about a number of voting issues.
In Ohio, we want to see a high voter turnout in every election. And by the way, we have seen in the last few years high voter turnouts. In 2016, it was one of the highest turnouts we've ever seen in Ohio. In 2018, it was the highest turnout governor's election ever in our history. I think that trend will continue in 2020. Not only will it be the highest participation rate, because a lot of people want to vote, but it's going to be the highest participation in early voting and absentee voting as well, and that's a good thing. In fact, we announced earlier this week that over 1 million Ohioans have already requested their absentee ballot, and we want that trend to continue because it's a convenient and secure way to make your voice heard. Ohioans on the Republican and the Democratic side, or independent Ohioans, have learned to trust that Ohio's absentee voting process is secure because of all the safeguards that exist. And so there's a lot of noise out there, but Ohioans know that when you vote from the comfort of home by mail, that the ballot's going to be received by your Board of Elections, it's going to be under bipartisan custody at the Board of Elections, and it's going to be one of the first votes counted on election night. When you see those results at 7:35 or 7:45, those are those absentee ballots because they're ready to count right as soon as the polls close. Ohioans know that we maintain accurate voter rolls. That's another reason to trust absentee voting in Ohio. Ohioans know that we ban the process of ballot harvesting, which has led to problems in other states. And so we prevent that from happening here in Ohio. But we also have in Ohio the ability to track your ballot. So just like you would track a package that you order online, you can track your ballot at voteohio.gov. You can make sure that it's been received by your Board of Elections. And while you're there, once you've already sent in your ballot, you can sign up, or your application, you can sign up to be a poll worker, because we need thousands of Ohioans still to sign up to be poll workers and make sure that for their neighbors there's a safe and secure voting day experience on November 3rd. The state constitution says you've got to be registered before October 5th, so the push is really on right now for voter registration. We want to see as many Ohioans registered to vote as possible. Of course, it's easy to do online. You can just go to voteohio.gov, where you can get registered to vote right there on the website. But also places like Esoteric here, through our Raise a Glass to Democracy initiative, and 50 other microbrews and craft brewers all over the state of Ohio have all partnered with us on this, including, by the way, Rheingeist here in Cincinnati, which really helped lead the charge on this way back in the summer when we first approached them. At these locations, they'll offer voter registration forms and, of course, instructions about how to do it online as well. Really, since this country's founding, right, people have gathered at bars and pubs and brew houses and that kind of thing to have these great political conversations. I think we've all been part of those, where you know, your friends may want to pound the table and tell you what their opinion is about how things ought to be, but all of that is just talk unless you're a registered voter, right? You've got to get registered to vote so that you can actually make your voice heard. And so our idea was to partner with the Ohio Craft Brewing Association and see how many of their members may want to sign up to be part of Raise a Glass to Democracy. And we are happy to say that over 50 now have signed up. And so these brew pubs, these craft brewers all over Ohio are serving as voter registration hubs. People can come there, get registered to vote, of course have a drink safely using social distancing and that kind of thing with their friends, and it's all around a win-win, and that's why we're doing it along with barbershops and beauty salons, because again, those are also places where people tend to have these great political conversations. Well, you know what? Take that passion that you have and put it into action by signing up, by being a registered voter, and also by signing up to be a poll worker. The Secretary of State's office can really impact two major things, two things that help empower people to live a better life. One is to get people involved in their communities as a voter or as a candidate for office. And second, entrepreneurship, because all new businesses start at the Secretary of State's office. I set two very simple goals for our Diversity and Empowerment Council. If we can increase minority business ownership, and if we can increase minority civic participation through voting and running for office, then we'll be a success.
Next, a lesson about voting, struggle, and perseverance from civil rights freedom rider Betty Daniels Roseman when Let's Talk Cincy returns. Over the years, I've had the opportunity to meet some amazing people, people who have had the audacity to dream big. One person is 81-year-old Betty Daniels Roseman. Mrs. Roseman is one of the freedom riders of the civil rights movement. She and other young people had a strong voice that moved a nation. In 2020, her voice is still strong, reminding us of the struggle and the importance of voting.
Well, I really loved my mom, and in New Orleans, you know, everything was segregated. My mom, we had separate schools, supposedly separate but equal, but they were not equal. We walked to school every day, the black children. My mother wanted to vote, and she had been down to to try to register. Black people in New Orleans could not vote during that time unless they owned property. She didn't own property. So she would go and try to register, and they would give them a test. And the test had questions like, how black is midnight? How many stars are in the sky? And the test was designed for failure, so nobody could answer that. So black people were being turned away, and they wouldn't even consider it if they didn't have property. And I was in high school, so I would come home from school and my mom would be in tears. And she really wanted to vote, but she was unable to do it. So I decided, I heard one evening I came home and I heard a young man on TV. He was talking about CORE. And CORE was aware of all these things happening in the Deep South and what people were going through. So they decided they were going to come to New Orleans. They were going to organize a CORE chapter there. Their headquarters was New York. So they were going to come and set up a meeting and try to help change some of the situations in New Orleans. So I made up my mind that when CORE comes, I'm going to go to their meeting and try to join, because I wanted to make sure my mother had a chance to vote. It was when the first Freedom Ride, when the first one, the group left Washington. They were headed for New Orleans. They were coming to New Orleans to help set up. And you remember that the bus was bombed in Alabama, Anniston, Alabama. So that was my deciding factor. Emotionally, I go back to all of it from the beginning when I first joined CORE, the training, how dedicated we were one to another. And I want to say this, that it was a motivation. We could not stop. I tell people when I speak, it was a motivation from God. We couldn't stop. Once we started, there was no way we could turn around. And I speak for myself, but if you could talk to some of the other CORE members, they would tell you the same thing. Every time we boarded a bus to leave home to go on a freedom ride, we didn't know if we would ever return home. And it was very hard because I would have to tell my family, I will see you later, or I'll see you in the morning, and we'll go in Alabama, we'll be back tomorrow. But it was very hard because we knew the chances were that we may not be returning. Freedom Riders were testers. All of the legislation that was passed to end segregation throughout the Deep South, but it was not being adhered to. There were laws, there were bills that were passed, but there was still segregation going on. So we went on a freedom ride. It was 4 young ladies and 1 young man. He was a white student. He joined our CORE group. His name was Frank Nelson, Jr., and he came from California down to New Orleans to help with our group. We went to Birmingham, testing along the way. On the way back from Birmingham, we didn't get served at any of the white restaurants or anything in the bus station. We came to a little town in Mississippi. It was called Poplarville, Mississippi. Now this little town already had a reputation. This little town had had a lynching there maybe a year before the Freedom Rides. And the young man was a black a man that lived there. His name was Charles Mack Parker Jr. And he was accused of looking or whistling at a white woman in a store, and he was brutally beaten. He was murdered, and he was thrown in the Pearl River in Poplarville. On the way back from Birmingham, it was around 8 o'clock that night when the bus pulled into Poplarville. The riders on the bus had assignments. My assignment on that ride was to make a phone call if anything happened along the way. I was to call New Orleans Corps and let them know what was going on. The two girls and Frank got off. They were to get off and go into the bus station and test to see if they would be served. We were on the bus, the other two girls and I, and the three of them went into the station. A few minutes later, truckloads of men, white men, pull up. They ran into the bus station, and they literally drugged Frank and the two young girls. They were black students, drugged them out of the bus station, threw them in the back of the pickup truck, and drove off. So I was praying and asking God to help me, because I knew if they found me, I would be another victim in the Pearl River.
Your mom, did she ever get a chance to vote?
She did get to vote. She wanted, really, President Kennedy was her person that she, really wanted to get a chance to vote for. She did eventually get the vote. I was on the road, because participating in Corps took me to other places, to other freedom rides throughout different states. And she did get the vote before she died. But then she was very hurt when, I was here when President Kennedy got killed.
A final thought now. I've never really been able to understand why people don't vote. I've heard the reasons or the excuses. But you'll have to excuse me, I just don't get it. Maybe it's because as a child I saw how important voting was to my mother and my grandparents. Maybe I've heard too many stories like the one we just heard from Betty Daniels Roseman. Well, that does it for the program today. I want you to email us your ideas at ltc@WLWT.com. And remember, you can always watch full episodes on WLWT.com/Let'sTalkCincy. You can also listen to Let's Talk on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining me for another edition of Let's Talk Cincy. We'll see you right back here next week.